Hello everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of Busboys and Poets, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion with editors and several contributing authors of ASEXUALITIES, Feminist and Queer Perspectives. Busboys and Poets is a community where racial and cultural connections are consciously uplifted and a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally thrive. Our Busboys and Poets servers will be putting in orders throughout the program for our folks here in person. I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion and a book signing after the program. And Asexualities is available here for purchase, along with a few other selections of asexuality books. And for our folks joining in online, you can purchase the book until 10 p.m. tonight through Eventbrite. Now, a little bit about the book we'll be discussing. As one of the first book-length collections of critical essays on the topic of asexuality, Asexualities, Feminist and Queer Perspectives became a foundational text in the burgeoning field of asexuality studies. This revised and expanded 10-year anniversary edition both celebrates the book's impact and features new scholarship at the vanguard of the field. While this edition includes some of the most cited original chapters, it also features critical updates as well as new innovative work by both up-and-coming and established scholars and activists from around the world. It brings in more global perspectives on asexualities, engages intersectionally with international formations of race and racialization, critiques global capital's effects on identity and kinship, examines how digital worlds shape lived realities, considers posthuman becomings, experiments with the form of the manifesto, and imagines love and relation in ecologies that exceed and even supersede the human. This cutting-edge, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary book serves as a valuable resource for everyone, from those who are just beginning their critical exploration of asexualities to advanced researchers who seek to deepen their theoretical engagements with the field. Now, a little bit about our speakers here tonight. I'll just be telling you about the editors, and the authors will be introducing themselves throughout the program. KJ Serenkowski is the author of Suture, Trauma and Transbecoming, 2021. He is Associate Professor of Comparative American Studies and Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Oberlin College. Megan Milks is the author of Margaret and the Mystery of the Missing Body and Slug and Other Stories. With KJ Serenkowski, they co-edited the first Asexualities, Feminist and Queer Perspectives in 2014, as well as the recently released expanded 10-year anniversary edition. Now I'll pass it off to our speakers here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you to Busboys and Poets. Thanks to Nathan, who helped us coordinate this. Thank you to all of our contributors for being here. And thank you to those of you who are here with us in person and online. Okay, I'm gonna say just a little bit about the book, about like the history of the project before we turn things over to our contributors. How's my sound? Is this okay? Okay, great. Okay, so this is the 10-year, this is the 10-year anniversary of this book, which came out in 2014, but it's a project we, KJ and I started 15 years ago in 2008 when we met at a graduate student conference in Chicago. We were both presenting topics related to asexuality. We had lunch and we were like, how can we continue this conversation? At the time, there was very little scholarship published on asexuality, and the majority of it was within the social sciences. So we embarked on what would become the first edition of Asexualities, Feminist and Queer Perspectives. In that volume, we wanted to intervene in feminist and queer studies by calling attention to the importance of making space for asexuality within these fields. We also wanted to lay out feminist and queer possibilities for a more expansive understanding of asexuality. beyond a singular conception of ace identity. And so we call for a pluralization for asexualities. Our contributors to that first volume wrote and thought expansively about the definition of asexuality to account for the complexities of gender, race, disability, and medical discourse that shape our understandings of sex and its refusals. It's a decade later. The growth in scholarship on asexuality has been exponential, a growth that mirrors and interacts with an increasingly widespread recognition of asexuality in socio-political life, including more ace representation in art and media, a surge in people identifying as ace and aro, and a greater presence of asexuality in the public lexicon. In the years since we first hatched the idea for a volume called Asexualities, we've watched the field develop from a small handful of sociological essays to an emergent field with an extensive archive of multidisciplinary essays and book chapters, special issues of journals, scholarly monographs like Ellen Gibla's Asexual Erotics, and books geared towards popular audiences like Angela Chen's Ace. Yes, what a great illustration of exactly what I'm saying. And Shraddha J. Brown's Refusing Compulsory Sexuality and everything else that's on the table. Watching the field grow so rapidly has been exhilarating, and we've been cheered and humbled to see the ways in which our volume has contributed to this growth. At the same time, feminist and queer studies has remained a bit slow on the uptake. In these fields, asexuality may get a mention in an introductory sentence or in a footnote, but few scholars outside of asexuality studies have really brought it to the fore. These and other fields, quite simply, need more ace perspectives. So as the book's 10-year anniversary approached, it seemed like an appropriate time to think about revising and expanding the first edition. We wanted to honor its impact while also accounting for the growth and expansion of the field. In the new volume, we've included a number of reprints and updates of essays that appeared in the first edition, and we've gathered with them 16 incredible new essays that bring in new global perspectives, additional attention to racialization and trans perspectives, and exciting connections to fields like geography and queer ecologies. This new edition retains the strongly interdisciplinary nature of the first volume, yet it's more diverse in style, including a collaborative experiment in chatty girl talk, as well as a number of manifestos. We've also bridged scholarship and activism by including contributions by scholar activists, two of whom are with us today. So today we have 7 of our contributors, both in person and on Zoom. They'll each share a bit about, actually let me pause. Do you have anything to add to this intro? Okay. So we have 7 contributors, voila. They'll each share a bit about their essays for the volume, and then we'll have some closing remarks and end with a Q&A. So we encourage your questions very much, but please save them for the end.
And just to add to that, we're going to pass the mic back and forth and introduce each speaker before they talk, and they're going to talk just for about 5 minutes, a little bit about their chapter. And I think the one thing that I would add before we jump into that is just in thinking about pluralizing asexualities, I think it's really important to highlight the expansiveness of asexuality and aromanticism. They're so often described as a lack, right? To not want to have sex, to not want to engage in romantic relationships, as if there's something that somebody's abstaining from, right? And I think that what you'll see in our conversation tonight is that these identities and also these frameworks that are existing in the world open up the possibilities for how we relate to one another, experience desire, experience pleasure, and live in relation to ourselves, to others, and to the world around us. So, with that said, I think we have a really great lineup of people who are going to talk about the different ways that they've approached the topic of asexuality in this book. And we're going to start off with one of the contributors from the original edition that came out 10 years ago, and we actually reprinted that essay because it was a really impactful essay. And so that first speaker is Christina Gupta, who is an associate professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Wake Forest University, and is currently finishing her second book, Acing Science, Compulsory Sexuality, Asexual Possibilities, and the Deconstruction of Sex. And Christina, as I mentioned, was one of the original contributors to the first volume. And one of the things that I think felt really important in republishing this essay was that it was really a landmark piece where it took a legal case and did a legal analysis in order to think about how asexual and disability communities could build coalition with one another. So it really takes it as an impact in sort of thinking about how do we go from a study, a legal study, to thinking about the real possibilities for organizing in the world. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Christina, who is on the screen behind me.
You're muted. We can't hear you. Oh no, hold on. Sorry. One sec.
No, yes, no?
Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you for your patience.
Sorry, I can't see anybody except the other folks who are remote, so I'm just gonna talk to them. I hope that's okay. But please interrupt me if you can't hear me or if it's not clear enough. Thank you so much to KJ and Megan for their work on both editions and in general for all of the amazing work that they've done to foster feminist and queer scholarship on asexuality. So as was mentioned, my chapter appeared in the initial edition and appears in the revised edition and called Asexuality and Disability, Mutual Negation in Adams v. Rice and New Dimensions for Co-Building.
One sec, Christina, you cut out, sorry.
Any
You're kind of cutting in and out, and we've got people working on the connection.
Let's see. I can try.
Oh, that's better. Did we get it?
Is that better? That's better on mine.
Yes.
Should I keep going?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Or to think through.
Oh, sorry, one sec. I think it's this mic actually. So. Oh, it is. Oh, okay.
It might be Christina's connection.
Oh, it might be your connection, Christina.
That might be my connection.
But you're working now, so let's try one more time.
Every time.
Okay, Christina, sorry. We're gonna try someone else and come back to you.
Okay,
Sorry
no
about
problem.
this.
I'll try and join from a different device maybe.
Okay, awesome, thanks.
All right, no problem. I think that might mean it's us.
Oh, yes. Yes, it is. Let me introduce you, Nicole and Joella. Okay, so next up we've got Nicole and Joella. Nicole Seymour, excuse me, works at the intersection of queer theory and environmental studies. Her books include Bad Environmentalism, Irony and Irreverence in the Ecological Age, and Glitter, part of the Object Lessons series. She's currently professor of English at California State University, Fullerton, and she co-wrote an amazing essay on an ACE intervention into queer ecologies with Joella Jacobs, who is also with us. Joella Jacobs is assistant professor of German studies at the University of Arizona. Her research engages with plants, animals, the environment, Jewish identity, science, gender and sexuality in Germanophone, literature and culture since the 19th century. Okay, hopefully this will work. Take it away.
Okay, so we're doing a two-hander here. We're going to bounce back and forth between each other. So our essay is titled Asexual Ecologies, and I'll start with two pieces of context to help clarify what we're up to here. So number one, asexuality has long been sidelined in queer scholarship, which our editors referred to earlier on, including in my subfield of queer ecologies, which is basically a cross between queer theory and environmental studies. Piece of context number two, plants and fungi have long been sidelined in popular culture and the sciences. So for example, there's this problematic but evocative term plant blindness that's used to refer to how plants and fungi, for example, are left out of mainstream discourses of species extinction. So you may have heard that the black rhino is extinct, maybe not, or that orangutans are endangered, but you probably haven't heard about the white hibiscus or the Florida yew tree being extinct or endangered. But now that plants and fungi are starting to receive more attention, so you probably have noticed, for instance, that mushrooms are really hot right now. So now that plants and fungi are starting to receive more attention, especially for their sexual diversity, their asexual aspects are still largely ignored or lumped in with forms of sexual reproduction. We therefore wanted to theorize what we're calling asexual ecologies. So in our essay, we consider how non-human forms of asexuality are and aren't comparable to human forms of asexuality. So put more simply, plants and fungi are just like us, and plants and fungi are not just like us. And as I turn this over to Joella, I just want to make sure, could everyone hear that? Because I did not. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So then I hope you can hear me too. So to do that, let's start with a little bit of the biology recap, because I'm sure we're not all remembering all of our high school biology or whatever it may have been. So what does asexual actually mean for plants and fungi? They have two kinds of reproduction, sexual and asexual. The sexual kind is most familiar to pollination, which leads to the meeting of sperm and egg. You all know the bees and flowers. The asexual kind is, on the other hand, just one plant or fungus that's budding, fragmenting, sporing, or some other kind of cloning. But you know that too because you've seen a cutting grow into a new plant. But most plants alternate between these two forms of reproduction, which sets them up for maximal chances of survival. There are even some animals that can reproduce asexually, such as sea sponges, which, yes, means that SpongeBob is asexual, but hold your seahorses, is he really? All I've told you about is reproduction, which is a behavior, but that is, of course, not the same as being asexual in identity. Yet there's a long, long history of paralleling plant reproduction with human sexuality, and that begins with asexuality. Scientists initially thought that plants had only one sex and were reproducing asexually. When this changed in the 18th century, which is pretty late, in the whole scheme of things, Carl Linnaeus categorized plants according to the genitals and reproduction methods. So ordering principles like that one are very common and show just how much sexuality structures the natural sciences and Euro-Western ways of viewing the world. But plants did not conform well to a male-female binary, so that Linnaeus' system produced 24 different categories. Only one of these is for asexually reproducing plants, even though many more engage in both kinds of reproduction. But that disappears behind the sexual reproductive capacity. So what used to be the predominant theory about the asexual reproduction of plants was sidelined just as soon as sexual reproduction was discovered, and discourse about plants became all about sex, which was, that is allosexual, where allo means other-oriented. While having 24 different sex categories of queer fungi can have a normalizing effect, showing that a wide range of sexual behaviors are natural, it is missing the inclusion of asexuality, not least because sexuality is understood in the sense of reproduction, and because this discourse is so allosexual. Yet equating sexual behaviors with identities is just one of the several false equivalencies between humans and non-humans built into the biological language around sex, gender, and sexuality.
We see these kinds of false equivalencies, for instance, in biologist Merlin Sheldrake's 2020 popular science book, Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. In a section on truffles, which are the fruiting bodies of particular kinds of fungi, similar to mushrooms, Sheldrake, inexplicably, to my mind, employs an epigraph about pimping from the legendarily allosexual singer Prince. He also declares that, quote, in human history, truffles have long been associated with sex, end quote. This was news to me, and I don't know if this is actually true. Okay, he then launches into a larger discussion of attraction, for example, talking about how truffles make themselves attractive via smell to animals such as dogs and pigs, who then carry the fungus's spores off to a new location and thus extend their genetic life. So here it seems as if sensory attraction and sexual attraction have been collapsed. One of asexuality studies' most important contributions has in fact been to fine-tune discussions of attraction, such as with the quote-unquote split attraction model that distinguishes among sexual, romantic, aesthetic, sensual, emotional, intellectual, and other forms of attraction. We don't need to be nitpicky here, but rather to illustrate that even in progressive spaces, allocentrism often prevents us from understanding the unique qualities and potentials of plants and fungi. So these failed attempts, like Sheldrake's, at connecting implicitly allosexual humans and implicitly allosexual non-humans on a biological level should give us pause about attempting to do the same for asexual humans and asexually capable non-humans. In fact, we would really resist any attempts to naturalize or justify human asexuality via the non-human, not just because it doesn't work. So as we noted earlier, what we mean when we refer to non-humans as asexual is a matter of reproduction, not of activity or identity, right? But because it participates in a problematically normative process, which is not to discount the humor and pleasure of claiming SpongeBob as a member of the team. The oldest trick in the book is to say that what's natural is normal, when in fact what is natural can be constructed for sexist or homophobic ends. And we might actually point out that the impulse to connect asexual humans to asexually capable non-humans can and has gone in a very discriminatory rather than liberatory direction. As activist Rhonda J. Brown summarizes, drawing on empirical studies, quote, asexuals are seen as the least human of all sexual minorities, as both animalistic and mechanistic, end quote.
So where do we go from here? It seems that what we need in the face of such subjection is a form of asexual awareness and sex neutrality that recognizes the great diversity and the unique capacities of humans and non-humans in terms of biology and behavior. Which brings us to the question of what we can learn conceptually or even politically from plants and fungi. First, we would argue that plants and fungi potentially remind us of the importance of building coalitions among disparate but interrelated groups and of prioritizing non-sexual bonds. We see such non-human bonds in the symbiosis between trees and fungi root systems. When it comes to humans, symbiosis might look something like, say, strengthening political bonds between cisgender women and trans people from the standpoint of bodily autonomy, an important coalition at a time when both reproductive rights and trans healthcare are under attack. Similarly, plants and fungi teach us in the many ways that they can reproduce that there's a diversity of ways to do things.
Finally, and relatedly, plants and fungi can inspire us to resist turning asexual behaviors and activities into identities. On that note, we are less interested in the category of asexual itself and more the behaviors and potentials that it entails. And we're therefore very taken with the preference for ace over asexual that many scholars and activists have articulated. So one of them, Angela Chen, has argued that dwelling on individual asexual identities prevents us from seeing ace within larger structures, how it opens up new ways of living and allows us to critique compulsory sexuality, among many other things. In fact, we would observe that while asexual functions as an adjective or noun, ace functions as a verb, as in to beat in competition, to outwit, or to earn high marks in. Therefore, ace ecologies probably captures best what we hope to have shown about rethinking and acting on conceptions of entanglement, coalition, diversity, flexibility, and openness of both humans and non-humans. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we're still waiting for Christina to get back. So we're gonna come back to the live stage, and our next speaker sitting next to me is Allison Spurgis. Allison is an associate professor of sociology and affiliate faculty in women's gender and sexuality studies at Trinity College. They are the author of 2 books, Diagnosing Desire and Decolonized Self-Care. And Allison contributed a chapter to this new volume with a very titillating title, Between the Bedroom and the Laboratory, which offers an asexual perspective that turns the science of sex and sex therapy itself on its head. And it asks us to question not just what we mean by sex, but also how science is constructed and how it constructs our beliefs about sex, pleasure, and desire. And I think Allison's going to read a titillating segment from that chapter.
Thank you. Thank you, KJ and Megan, so much. Really excited to be here and to be a contributor to the volume, a new one. So yes, as KJ mentioned, my chapter is called Between the Bedroom and the Laboratory, and the subtitle is Clinical Intimacies, Para-Erotic Potential, and Therapeutic Excess. And in this chapter, I do think about the kind of both disciplinary and productive operations of sexology and sex research, but I also focus on sex therapy, including like pop psychology, and in its like popular media forms. So I'm going to talk about that today. I'm going to read a little bit from a section called Sex is Good for You, Normative Discourses of Sex as Well-Being in Contemporary Sex Therapy and Popular Media. Sex therapy, like sex research, assumes an untapped sexual desire in any given person. And this makes sense. What else would sex therapy do? But what is notable is that in today's sex therapy, there's been a proliferation into the popular sphere. Its jurisdiction is no longer solely professional medicine, nor is it really under any type of expert gatekeeping. And it assumes that sex is inherently good, or that it can be. The notion that sex is a good unto itself is further promoted in a variety of contemporary sex manuals, which are primarily targeted to cis-het women. In the 2020 trade book, for instance, Taking Sexy Back, How to Own Your Sexuality and Create the Relationships You Want, psychologist Alexandra Solomon advocates this theme when she states, your sexuality is much more than to whom you are attracted or what you do or don't do in bed. It is a central part of who you are, and it is about how you navigate the physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual need for pleasure, closeness, and connection. But why is it that sexuality is so central in this formulation? And it is central, it's a sex manual after all. And how are other non- or asexual forms of pleasures, closeness and connection, elided when we focus on sexuality so intently in what we might, following Ella Pritchfield, call a sexual society? This formulation of sex as inherently good and the importance of doing it naturally is also rife with ableist assumptions, and thus useful here is also in Jung Kim's theorization of the connection between disability and asexuality. Sexuality, health, well-being, and the good life, a classist, racist, and colonialist concept to be sure, are explicitly linked via historical and contemporary sex therapy discourses. But there is always a queer excess, and in this chapter, I argue that that queerness need not be framed as normatively romantic, nor even fully within the realm of the sexual. There may be room in sex therapy for desiring sideways and for parasexuality or para-eroticism. For instance, in a discussion of mindfulness to enhance desire and get comfortable with one's body, Solomon suggests incorporating affirmations into one's mindfulness regimen and cites the need for a little bit of couples therapy for you and your vulva, so that relationship can be as loving as it can be. She goes on to describe how wishing your vulva good morning and telling her that she's beautiful and powerful and yours is a good way to develop this relationship. While some of this is obviously a feminized trope that fits clearly within the broader genre of women's sexual self-help and self-care, there is something here too that feels a bit, well, queer and maybe even kinky, when part of the therapeutic process itself involves personifying and conversing with one's body in this way, and even gesturing toward a BDSM relationship via power and ownership of one over their own vulva. And what of the potential for asexual intimacies between oneself and one's vulva, or with any other body part, personified or not? In a recent sex therapy book targeted to couples, but which promotes a protocol that has more often been suggested as useful for sexually dysfunctional cisgender men, called Good Enough Sex, or GES, Michael Metz and Barry McCarthy promote the idea of not having unrealistic sexual expectations, but in a much different way than this idea is put forward, for instance, in Julia Hyman's 1977 classic, Becoming Orgasmic. In much of the mid to late 20th century sexual self-help literature targeted to women, the woman who wants too much from a partner is reminded to come back down to earth, or to temper her expectations for sex. But in Metz and McCarthy's Enduring Desire, the cishet man who expects to be able to regularly perform well in bed, often measured in terms of penile vaginal intercourse, and satisfy a tacitly, implicitly cishet woman, is advised that these expectations might be too lofty. Though gender differentiated, the tenets of pop sex therapy are thus complementary. While cis heteronormativity, healthism, and ableism are undercurrents running through even some of the feminist sex therapy manuals from the 70s through today, I argue there is also a queerness, a cripness, and an aceness if you look close enough. For example, the vision of good enough sex promoted by Metz and McCarthy includes a prototypical aging cishet couple becoming what they call erotic friends. Even as the book broadly advocates for embracing one's innate sexuality, appreciating the built-in personal sex drive imperative, and valuing sex as inherently good, those are all quotes from the book, thus painting a very normative picture of desire and relationality, it also has an oddball queerness threaded throughout. In a chapter entitled The Gender Team, the authors explain how GES is imperative for men, particularly as men tend to be obsessed with their own performance and with pleasing their partner, and thus need to learn how to enjoy pleasuring, described as low-stakes sexual activity that does not culminate in penile vaginal intercourse for its own sake, as a member of an intimate erotic team. With the protocol explicated in Enduring Desire, or while that protocol is undoubtedly cis heteronormative, as it is targeted to cishet people in long-term monogamous relationships, there is something that feels very queer, erotic, and perhaps even para-erotic in the way the authors describe straight folks learning to become erotic friends. This resonates not only with queerness, but with asexuality, with aceness, or what I've called parasexuality, and at times, reading this particular manual feels like a queer, crip, ace how-to guide. Maybe erotic friends don't have sex at all. Maybe they simply cuddle or explore non-sexual kink, or as KJ Serenkowski has put it in his book, Suture, maybe they appreciate the pleasure of touch simply for being the touch that it is, rather than imagining it on the way to some perceived greater pleasure. Maybe they are a team, but unlike Metz and McCarthy's cis-heteronormative gender team, maybe they wrap their bodies together like slugs, feeling that closeness as pleasure, like a genderless slime team. And here I am invoking the work of Megan Milks on slug erotics and slimy intimacies. And I'll end there, and I can answer any other questions from my chapter in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna go to Justin now, and then we'll come back to Christina. Okay, next up, Justin Smith. Dr. Justin Smith is an assistant professor of English and Black Studies at Randolph-Macon College. His research focuses on late 19th and early 20th century African-American literature with an emphasis on critical race theory and the Black radical tradition. His current monograph, In Progress, demonstrates the dynamic connection between fluid literary styles and shifting conceptions of racial meaning at the turn of the 20th century. Justin brings a wonderfully thought-provoking and gorgeously written essay on race, asexuality, imagination, and the archives into the book. Justin.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, thank you for that introduction. Thank you, KJ and Megan. And my chapter somehow did not include an acknowledgement, which is completely my fault, but I did want to thank Yoling Chen, who's another contributor, put together a group where we talked about kind of the intersection of race and asexuality. A lot of the people in that group were also contributors. We gave each other feedback, so very much a community project, so lots of thanks to go around there. So I'm going to just highlight some of my chapter's main arguments, and then, like everyone else, happy to provide more detail in the Q&A afterward. Obviously, I would encourage anyone interested not to read my chapter, but the whole collection. I do think it's really, I was very much in awe kind of reading through the chapters I've read through, seeing the first edition of this book was important to me going through graduate school, and kind of seeing where things have come since then was very cool. So anyways, my chapter titled Subjective Limits of Imagination emerges from my own observations and frustrations as someone that works both in African American studies and asexuality studies. And while there is some amazing work at this intersection, and Iana Hawkins-Owen, of course, being a foundational thinker here, and he really has a great essay to close out the collection, which I would encourage everyone to read. But in general, the scholarship here is pretty sparse. I think I can count on one hand the scholars that really approach how closely these fields are connected with any sort of expertise. I naturally kind of gravitated towards this intersection of Black studies and asexuality studies as two things I found personally fascinating. And also because, you know, when you go through graduate school, they kind of train you to write about things that haven't really been written about, so it kind of made sense. And the more I read and wrote and got feedback, the more I realized just how much was going on with this general inability to see, and as I argued about the chapter, to imagine kind of this intersection. So my overall argument then is that Black studies needs asexuality studies and vice versa in order to expand our conception of Black life, but really all, like, everyone's sort of how we imagine people in relation to each other. So one part of my argument revolves around a close engagement with some of Sadia Hartman's work. She's another scholar who does work in Black studies. She writes very beautifully about the attempts to recover Black lives from the archives. And her book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, I think is just kind of happens to be one of the best examples of what I'm talking about in terms of this failure to consider Blackness and asexuality in doing that important work. So that's one part of my argument. And the other is kind of this more personal account of some of my previous work and how it kind of relates to my own journey through the world, I guess, how I'm perceived as well. In regards to that more personal element, one thing I discuss in the chapter is how sexuality is fluid, and it doesn't always make sense to label yourself something. And I think that's a theme throughout several sections of the collection. But specifically, I hone in on how other people's assumptions about my own sexuality previously kind of really parallel some research that I did later on around Claude McKay and his 1928 novel, Home to Harlem. In both my own case and the case of one of the characters in that novel, I wrote, that was one of my first articles I published. I won't get into the details, but it's kind of an interesting analysis I kind of do of different scholarship around that article. And it's an interesting novel if you're into 1920s African American literature. But one of the things I noticed in my own case and in the case of that novel was there was this assumed same-sex attraction based on a Black male character, or myself in this case, being in close proximity to other men without being seen with other women. And so there's this, in my own life and in my own research, there's this pushback on this idea of Black men. There's like this assumption that they have to embody some sort of allosexuality at all times. From that starting point, I look at how this pattern plays out with all sorts of Black people that scholars have attempted to recover from the archives. Even in some cases where we have evidence of Black people saying they're not interested in sex, there's this assumption that's somehow trying to cover something up. So the area I work in, there's this kind of idea of this, quote unquote, vow of secrecy that Black women kind of use to appear respectable in terms of this idea of like respectability politics. That's kind of one example where it's interesting to me that there's this assumption that they must be hiding something that can't really be their true, they can't actually not be interested in sex. But as I said, Sadia Hartman's book kind of takes up that same line of thinking. She really imagines, and she looks at that same period that I also focus on in my other research, and really imagines quite vividly the sex lives of particularly African American women, but also African American men during that time, often in the absence of direct evidence. And she's kind of using that as a way to kind of recover their humanity by kind of trying to unpack like what that means to kind of have that connection between like their humanity and their sexuality in that particular sort of way. And I make the case that this is really all a matter of imagination, and that imagination is quite personal. I understand the stakes, especially around these identity issues, for people to want to claim or reclaim certain people or certain lifestyles. And I never try to, quote unquote, prove anyone's sexual identity. As I said, it's kind of, it can be fluid anyway, obviously. But ultimately, I'm trying to argue that we should practice that sort of honesty about where we're coming from and our own assumptions, both with these historical figures and also with the people around us every day. And I argue that we can grapple with our own biases. You might also be able to imagine different lifestyles for ourselves and the people around us. And that doing so may also lead to then different sort of political possibilities in terms of our rights and freedoms. Obviously, we know how those can be under attack at a time like this. A lot of the chapters in this collection, I think, also speak to this idea of reimagining our relationships with people around us. And I think my chapter adds to that by also asking us to imagine how our racialized assumptions about sexuality also end up limiting the types of relationships that we can imagine. So I will leave it off there, and like I said, happy to talk more in the Q&A as well.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and I think we have Christina back now, so we're gonna try again. Christina Gupta talking about mutual negation and asexuality and disability.
Okay, can you hear me all right now?
Yes.
All right, great. So I'm gonna thank KJ and Megan again, just in case the first two times didn't go through, because it's worth doing it again. So thank you both for all the work that you've done to foster feminist and queer scholarship on asexualities. I'll be really brief. As I already said, my chapter was, in the first edition and has been reprinted. It was an attempt to think through like disconnections between early asexual visibility projects and some disability rights projects, as well as potential intersections and potential for coalition work. as you probably know, both groups, people with disabilities and asexual people, have been called by the name of the other as a way to discredit them. So asexuality has been seen as the product of an illness, or as an illness itself, as a way of suggesting that it should be changed or fixed. People with disabilities have had their sexual rights violated, and have been desexualized as a way of denying their full personhood. So understandably, some early asexual visibility projects responded by arguing that asexual people aren't sick or disabled, while concurrently some disability rights movements prior to a greater awareness of asexuality responded by arguing that people with disabilities are sexual just like everyone else. And so in the chapter, I look at how this dynamic played out in relation to a specific employment discrimination case of the case of Adams v. Rice. If you're interested in the details, you can look at the chapter, or I'd be happy to answer questions during the Q&A. But basically the point is to argue that this kind of mutual negation leaves out intersections and coalitions. So it leaves out the folks who identify as ace and arrow and as a person with a disability, whether one of those is seen as causing the other or not. And it ignores possibilities for coalitions that can exist, including between non-disabled ace and arrow folks and allo-disabled folks. And so these possibilities for coalition include a common opposition to unwanted and unneeded medical treatment, while calling for expanded access to wanted and needed medical treatments. It also includes a common need for greater sexual self-determination and the resources needed to exercise that self-determination, such as sexual health education that includes asexual and disabled perspectives, for example. So in any case, the chapter deals with this case from 2008. So the specifics are a decade and a half old now. I think asexual communities have become much more explicit about welcoming folks with disabilities and welcoming folks who experience their asexuality to be a product of illness or disability. However, I still think the broader questions about how groups respond to, on the one hand, pathologization, or on the other hand, desexualization, so how we respond to that while supporting ace people and people with disabilities remains relevant. And I think the broader questions about how to think through coalition work remain relevant. So thank you for that, and I'm happy. I was going to say I was looking forward to hearing from the new contributors, but I'm glad to hear it from the folks that we've already heard from. So thank you very much.
Our next speaker is CJ Deluzio-Chason, who is a PhD candidate in applied social psychology at the University of Windsor. And they have also authored several articles and chapters on asexuality and continue to do work as a local ACE and community organizer. And CJ's chapter, like Nathan's, who will get to talk after CJ, is a sort of manifesto that really lifts the words off the page and asks us to imagine and build truly ace and arrow friendly worlds that we can live in and thrive in. And so I'm gonna turn it over to CJ now to talk a little bit about your chapter.
Okay, I think I have my microphone turned on. Yes, thank you very much for, first of all, obviously thanking our lovely editors for all the work that they put into this and for inviting me to write a chapter in the first place. So I should probably what it's called, my chapter. So my chapter is called Toward an Ace and Error-Friendly Society, Reconstructing the Sexual Orientation Paradigm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of where we've gone. Yeah, sorry, there's reverb on the microphone. I just distracting. Yeah. So, building an ace and error-friendly society. Sorry, would you please mute the speaking? I'm hearing myself and it's echoing. It's really difficult to do words under the circumstances. Okay, I think that's better. Thank you so much. Okay, so mostly my chapter, it starts with talking about what it would mean to build an ace and error-friendly society. And I'm talking about from the context in which I live, so that's in Ontario on Turtle Island here in 2024. And why an ace-friendly society would also have to be an error-friendly society, so that would involve eliminating structures that disproportionately affect ace-associated demographics. So this would also be arrows, but we know more about the demographics of the ace community. So that ranges from heterosexism to transphobia, but all the way to carceral systems of prisons and policing, immigration, like making all of these connections. It would also involve eliminating structures that directly target our aceness or errorness. So namely compulsory sexuality, normativity, and institutions of monogamy. I mean this in an institutional way. So specifically, I talk about compulsory sexuality a little bit more in depth. Often when compulsory sexuality is discussed, it's discussed more superficially. People don't necessarily talk as much as I would like to see about how this really extends deep into the fabric of oppressive power structures. Compulsory sexuality structures the idea of humanness or legitimate personhood. So that's both in cooperation with amanonormativity and other institutional monogamy and other structures like ableism, but also does that alone. And compulsory sexuality functions as a powerful organizing force for white supremacy and aspects of colonization here, as well as other institutions like ableism, for example. So we can't dismantle it without dismantling all of these structures that it organizes. So in the chapter I talk about, I make these connections and the arguments for why this is the case so that you can follow the thread. And I'm really looking forward to Christine Gupta's new book, and hopefully we'll get into more details of compulsory sexuality on a deeper level there. And Sharonda Brown's book, Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, A Black Asexual Lens, I can't remember the full title. That was great, but you can only do so much in one book. So I'd like to see a lot more of that. So, as well as amanonormativity, the prioritizing of romantic relationships and how that works together in the institution of monogamy as an institution. So we're talking about persons as resources and access to resources in that way, and the implications of that and how that really limits the way that we organize our society and limits possibilities for other things like developing more substantive communities, connections, mutual aid, community care, things like that I think we really need to be developing in pursuit of an ace and error-friendly society, because in order to build this is going to require a full-scale reorganization of our society, from our relationships with each other and the state, but also the land and plants. Let's not leave them out. Water, various other things here. And then my chapter shifts a little bit to talk about, there's one place where we have unique potential to do something, to act like a site of praxis, which is actually around the concept of sexual orientation itself and moving beyond what I call the sexual orientation paradigm. So I talk a bit about the history of sexual orientation and how that came out of a context of resistance against criminalization of what we would now call LGBTQ folks and relationships. And that has come to be the main organizing principle of people's sexuality and how we're situated in society with respect to the prescriptive heterosexual norm. But in recent decades, we have seen the emergence of homonormativity, the idea of the respectable gay or the respectable lesbian or even bi or trans person and what that means. And part of this is the process of sexual orientation being recuperated instead of something to help challenge the criminalization. It's being recuperated to help uphold the status quo, particularly in a neoliberal context. And I'm not going to rant about neoliberalism for you, but a little bit it's under the logic of neoliberalism, people bear the moral responsibility for fitting into the structures of state regulation and control, including by inhabiting proper reproductive sexual citizenship, and that includes nuclear families as sites of care work, and whereas once homosexuality was transgressive, now there are respectable ways of all these things, but also failing to live up to that, for those of us who either can't or won't, means being the site of open to morally justified sanctions, including in the form of violence. And so this is really something that we're swimming in neoliberalism at the moment. So at the moment, sexual orientation eventually became a site of recuperation, so ongoing resistance. For ongoing resistance, we now need to shift something else. And this is what I'm talking about is the sexual orientation paradigm, which really focuses on with whom and maybe how people form romantic and sexual relationships, which are presumed to center their lives around and also presumed to be the ways that we produce kinship. So I'm going to read a little bit from the chapter about that, just to sort of explain that. So we cannot reform sexual orientation to accommodate us collectively by carving enough space for some of us to fit into the existing social structure shaped by compulsory sexuality and amatonormativity. That very social structure privileges and hinders certain forms of relationships and kinship. The development of gay and trans respectability politics and the emergence of a homonormativity has taught us the limitations of assimilation. At most, assimilationist agendas can grant us permission to remain a little bit deviant within a strictly regulated window of legitimacy, which will always reject any deviance that threatens the larger status quo. Still, there are assimilationist pressures on ace and arospec folks to structure our lives around long-term partnerships that can be slotted neatly into a framework of couple units, even if those partnerships are neither romantic nor sexual in nature. We are offered a place within the existing landscape of sexual orientation, quote unquote, as long as we eliminate or conceal elements of our ace and arospec selves and lives that do not fit. But we can and must reject inclusion politics and work to change the framework instead. So we need to shift against to shift against that, and we can start changing that from recognizing toward a diversity of possible types of relationships around which people may choose to center their lives, around which people may choose to center our lives. So changing the organization of society, sexuality, intimacy, and family so that ace and arospec folks are no longer inconvenient outsiders or exceptions, it fundamentally means destroying all of these oppressive social structures that maintain the status quo. And this is like I'm talking about when we're talking about how these things are linked in with white supremacy and colonization. We can't just wish it away. Like these are massive, massive social changes that won't happen easily or quickly. So the stakes are high. The aspects of our ace and arospec selves we are asked to carve away as a precondition for acceptance and inclusion are not just about our asexuality or aromanticism. Amatonormativity and compulsory sexuality function to uphold massive structures of white supremacy, colonialism, and ableism, among others. Well, they are not alone in doing so. Their destruction will be part and parcel of a larger revolutionary agenda and changes. There is radical potential in using our collective power to fight for our existence, all of our existences. Let's see if we get there, and I hope we get there. And this is some of the work that we can do to get there. So I think I will leave it there.
Thank you, CJ. Okay. And that's a really fantastic lead into our final contributor, presenter, Nathan Bernstein. Nathan Bernstein is a co-founder of and advocate with the ACE and Arrow Advocacy Project and co-wrote ACE and Arrow Journeys, which is available over here. They are currently getting a Master's of Education from Widener University Center for Sexuality Studies and are specifically interested in studying the way that Arrow and ACE individuals and communities fit into the larger queer populace. With their collaborator, Maximus Jenkins, Nathan contributed another kind of manifesto, this one against ace respectability politics, written with wonderful fervor and conviction. pass it to you, Nathan.
Hey folks, so when my collaborator and I, Max, who unfortunately isn't here, but who was crucial in writing this, and in fact did, I will explain how this could not have, how our section could not have been written without them. When we were thinking about what we would be interested in contributing, we were talking about, well, there are a lot of ways to talk about asexuality and how it fits into the larger world and the ways that it interacts with other identities. But we are more interested in looking inward and looking at the way asexuals behave amongst ourselves and the way we engage amongst ourselves and the way that we transform ourselves for wider society. Because that happens way more than the ways that wider society impacts us. We all have to interact with wider society. Unfortunately, they don't all have to acknowledge that we exist. So we decided to talk about the way asexuals behave in regards to respectability politics and the way that aces engage in respectability politics in order to assimilate. So this builds very much off of what CJ's essay is about, and getting into the details of how those respectability politics, how that forming this normativity behaves, and how we should be resisting it. And when I was talking to Max, they were talking about one of the things that they saw impacts the ACE community more than anything else, which was the discourse, also known as ACE discourse, primarily on Tumblr, but also other social media sites, and starting in the early 2010s, when queer individuals rejected asexuality as a legitimate orientation, and certainly as part of the queer community for all sorts of reasons. And it led to a tremendous number of ASPEC people being forced off of social media, and a huge number of ASPEC people who couldn't speak up about their asexuality or their experiences, and a huge number of asexual people who felt like they wouldn't have a home in queer communities overall, and they needed to withdraw. They needed to just stick to ACEs. And so when I say Max was invaluable with this, I am not somebody who engages in social media. Max was in the trenches and saw all of this go down and was able to and explained how all of this happened to me. And we actually found a thesis from someone discussing the discourse and looked up and read all about it, and we realized how much of ACE respectability politics really evolved as a reaction, both to overall queer communities' rejection of asexuality, but also to specifically the points that get brought up in the discourse. Like, for example, that asexuality is too confusing to outsiders. So what do? We limit ourselves. We don't talk about the identities that seem fake or that seem too made up. Like, we don't talk about people who are fictosexual because we're worried people are going to make fun of us. We don't talk about the identities that we think are going to be seen too weird, or the fact that so many people, and this goes back to what Christina was saying, the fact that so many people diagnose asexuality as a mental or physical disability. So we insisted on saying asexuality is healthy, or ACEs are healthy and normal, and by doing so, we are pathologizing and further alienating ACEs who are not healthy. And we are saying normal and healthy are the only ways to be. And being anything else is wrong or shameful. We buy into love-centric language, assimilationist love-centric language. So while the queer community overall has adopted the phrase "love is love," ACEs adopt the phrase "we can still love," and we highlight our romantic relationships or platonic relationships, which throws under the bus aromantic and aplatonic people, many of whom are asexual as well. So by trying to assimilate into these queer communities, into these larger queer communities, we are betraying members of our own community. And by trying to normalize ourselves, we are making those with identities that aren't palatable. We are forcing them into the shadows. We are forcing them out of our community, and we are doing this to ourselves. And we discuss in the chapter there are real, legitimate reasons why we should want to be part of larger queer communities. Larger queer communities, for one thing, are larger. We're gonna have a much easier time finding queer centers than we are gonna be finding ace centers. Ace centers aren't really a thing. So it'd be great if queer centers included us. And it'd be great if queer movements included a push for asexuals as well. So if the Equality Act, for example, didn't define sexuality as homosexuality, heterosexuality, and bisexuality, because that kind of leaves a pretty significant letter or two out. So we're not saying that being part of the queer community isn't something that should matter or isn't important, but rather that we need to, instead of transforming ourselves to better fit in with the queer community, we should be trying to work to transform queer communities and society at large so that they understand and accept that we are always there, we've always been part of it.
Thank you again to all of our contributors. I'm just going to close this out and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. I think, Nathan, what you were just saying sort of leads perfectly into concluding the program for the evening. I was going to read a couple chapters from our coda, but I also, I don't know, I want to say that, you know, we're in Washington, D.C., we're streaming this from the nation's capital. I spent the day walking, doing the thing you do, walk by the White House and, you know, through the mall. And, what this coda will gesture to, we wrote before, I think, Megan and I had any sense of what the current political circus in the United States would look like in fine detail, but with a strong awareness of the state of this country, right? And I will say, walking around today, I was sort of shocked and appalled to see the amount of Trump merchandise for sale. And so, you know, we're at this moment where I hope all of our contributors' work has demonstrated that thinking about asexuality is a political move toward freedom for all sorts of people, and it's valuable in thinking about you know, how to live in a world where fascism is always creeping up on us. So with that, I want to just read a couple chapters from the coda that Megan and I wrote. A couple paragraphs, not a couple chapters. I don't want to keep you here all night until tomorrow. A couple paragraphs. So we actually end the book with a unit on asolidarities and ace futures, which Nathan's and CJ's chapters are a part of. And the book as a whole, though, pushes us to imagine present and future worlds beyond sex and beyond the human, throwing us headfirst into the vanguard of asexual theorizing about our political futures. The last chapter of the book struggles with and delights in freedom dreams through coalition building, global solidarity, anti-racist, anti-colonialist, anti-ableist calls to action, and abolitionist visions for becoming free from multiple structures of oppression. In the final chapter, one of our contributors, Iana Hawkins-Owen, declares, asexuality must come to be synonymous not only with freedom from all forms of compulsion and coercion, but also with the project of becoming free. We end the book with this asexual orientation toward becoming free to again reinforce the ways asexualities matter to everyone. They provide new ways of connecting, of empowering, and of exploding the very concepts that would keep us wedded to capitalism and colonialism and their attendant hierarchies of subjectivity, desire, and freedom. Owen urges us to move toward asexual frames of connection, kinship, and survival, even as he recognizes and names that it will always be so much and not enough, never enough. We know too that this book is both so much and not enough, but we revel in that incompleteness. We still find value in those wandering middles and those refusals of meaningful ends. If we entertain, even metaphorically, Ria Markiewicz's claim that opens the book, sexuality is over, long live asexuality, we have to join her in that declaration. For asexuality and asexuality studies is still only just beginning, because there are so many ways to want and to desire, to relate and to love, to be and to live. This work, this life will never be enough, which is a fitting reminder. Asexuality is not about wanting less, but about wanting other than, wanting so much more. So let us end here with an invitation to more and new beginnings. Thank you all.
I'm going to open it up for questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and I'll pass you the mic. You can direct it to specific authors, or maybe if the editors want to answer questions.
Hi, thank you so much for creating this space, because as we mentioned, it's hard to find a space that really feels like it's for us, so it really means a lot. Two quick questions. One was, does any chapter touch on the more interpersonal lens? For example, an ace and allo romantic relationship, or an aro and allosexual relationship? Second question is whether there are recommendations for ace virtual or in-person spaces.
Well, I think Nathan, maybe you could have, do you have answers about spaces?
Yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a group in DC, which some people might have heard about this event from, called Aces and Aros of the Mid-Atlantic, which is a meetup group. So if you go on meetup.com, Aces and Aros of the Mid-Atlantic has meetups fairly frequently, and some people probably found out about this event through me posting it there. It's pretty great. I've been part of it since 2010. And there's always some interesting stuff going on. In terms of online spaces, there are a number of Discord servers that I could recommend, including the Ace and Aro Advocacy Project's Pride Chats, which if you go on if you go on tap.org, and you'll find a link there. Or beyond that, I'm sure there are a number of people in this room who could connect you to different online ASEX spaces.
And then the first part of your question was if the chapter in the book deals specifically with navigating an ace-allo relationship. We don't have a chapter that specifically addresses that. There are people who write from personal perspectives, but I think actually that Cody...
Yeah, I was going to recommend. So I am Ace. Cody does talk about navigating both navigating a romantic and sexual relationship as an asexual allo-romantic person with allosexual allo-romantic people. Cody's also got a second book coming out called the Ace and Aro Relationship Guide. And that book is actually going to be, they're doing their book launch with us on October 22nd at this location, and you can go on Busboys and Poets website, and the link is up. So just look October 22nd, it'll be right here. It'll be, again, a hybrid, so it'll be both virtual and in person, and I'm very much looking forward to that one.
I want to encourage people online to submit questions. We'll be taking online questions as well, but if you want to take another in person.
Hi, thank you so much.
You might need to come up a little bit. Yeah. It goes in and out sometimes.
It's like I'm over the target now.
Okay, here we go.
All right, thank you. So I have a question regarding if you have any content or have done any research regarding the intersection of asexuality and romanticism and neurodivergence, specifically autism and ADHD, that I find in the community that there there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of that. However, that is all I know. So like I was wondering if there's had been any solid research on that.
I think some of our online panelists would actually be able to speak to that pretty well if they would like to. If any of you would like to speak to the question of asexuality, aromanticism, and neurodiversity, neuroqueerness.
Neuroqueerness.
There's definitely been some articles published, specifically qualitative studies looking at people who identify as asexual as well as on the autism spectrum. So I don't know what would be the easiest way to share some of those citations, but for example, there was just an article published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior in 2021 that was looking at this particular intersection. So there's definitely people who are interested in doing some qualitative research with folks who identify as both asexual, ace or aro, and as well as on the autism spectrum.
Well, can you pull up that comment for you?
So Nicole
And,
also had a comment.
So that certainly like there are connections, people are making those connections and I think.
So Nicole Seymour, I don't know if you can put it up
I'll just
here.
end there, I think my question's going in.
Have a suggestion for Clem Bastow's Late Bloomer, which talks about neurodivergent and queer connection. It may not get into ASPEC identity specifically, but there is that as well.
And then I would also add, there's a book called Authoring Autism that mentions asexuality and demisexuality in relationship to autism. And I'll take the opportunity to plug my next book that'll be coming out in about a year. But it centers neuroqueerness as a way of thinking, writing, and reading in relationship to theorizing asexuality and absences. So the book is called Nothing Wanting, Asexuality in the Matter of Absence. And I think that for me, it's become a sort of intersectional way to think about different ways to be in the world, right, that resist the sort of normative construction of the human that then hierarchizes certain humans over other humans. And so my argument is really for an abolishment of the whole colonial structure of the human and humanism, and to recognize the ways in which we can all be neuroqueer in a variety of ways, and sexuality and relationships, romantic expression, platonic expression, singleness, all of those things are experienced differently and variably, and are often, those nuances and complexities of those experiences are often erased and reduced to nothing. And so I think that for me, neuroqueerness, neurodiversity, and asexuality, even aside from like diagnosis and identity, go hand in hand politically, like in terms of wanting to just resist dominant frameworks that tell you there's a right or wrong way to be in the world.
Open it up for another question. Okay, we can open it up for another question. Anyone in person? Well, if we have no more, I think, okay. You're gonna have to step up on here, actually. I'm gonna range of the mic, right here should be good.
Thank you everyone for all of your
If you could speak really into
Oh, yes, okay, there we go. Thank you for all of your amazing insight. I really appreciated this talk. I was just wondering, and this is sort of like a random question that it's like, oh, I'm at an ACE panel, let me ask about this thing that I'm interested in, but have you heard of, or have you done any research on health disparities in the ACE community? I'm like very interested in this topic, so thank you.
Yeah, does anybody online want to answer that? I don't want to put Christina on the spot again, but I know that's part of your research.
Yeah, so there's a group of researchers who has been the most recent ACE community data. Sorry, I don't know how well my sound's coming through, but has been taking the most recent ACE community survey data and has been using that to do quantitative analysis of health disparities. And so it's been looking at things like suicide rate, suicidal ideation, rates of substance abuse, and things like that. So I think it's coming out as a series of articles in a variety of journals. And so I don't know which ones are out and which ones are still coming out. But certainly they've been looking at it through the minority stress model, which is a broader model that looks at how folks with minority sexual or gender identities might have experienced health disparities, so higher rates of mental distress, as well as physical illness as a result of the kind of everyday experiences of discrimination that gender and sexual minorities experience. And so have been finding similar kinds of data for based on the ACE community survey, higher rates of these kinds of mental distress, and even including and different physical illnesses and physical distress. And so we're theorizing that as a result of these everyday daily experiences of discrimination that ACE and ARO people experience.
I can just add to that too. There's another research study that's being done by a PhD or a Doctor of Education candidate at Columbia University, Mahima Mira, who has been interviewing asexuals about their experiences with doctors and finding that a lot of people, when they have their asexual experience or identity dismissed by doctors, they tend to not seek healthcare, which will result in more health disparities. So that data is forthcoming, but people are working on that question for sure.
And just to add, there's a scientist whose name escapes me. I'll look it up once I'm off the stage. Who's studying rather than specifically ACE, but studying the singleism and medical outcomes. So the way single people are discriminated against in medical fields. So obviously, while that is the same as ACE, as the intersection between being ACE and medical fields, it's there's obviously a lot of crossover. And I'll look up that doctor when I'm off. She's working on writing a book now, but she's published several studies.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.
We'll open it up for now. Hi. If anyone else in person has a question, no questions are bad questions. And I think with that, we'll wrap it up. I want to say thank you one more time to our guests. Let's give it up one more time. I also want to remind you that Asexualities is here available for purchase, and for our online folks, you can still purchase the book through Eventbrite until 10 p.m. tonight. And our in-person folks, we also have a variety of other asexuality books if you want to browse through and purchase one of those. Our in-person authors and editors will be signing copies, so this is a really special opportunity. If you already have yours, you might know someone who would really benefit from having this book, so we encourage you to purchase it here tonight. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your night.